Having a Gas is the podcast that talks to the great and the good of the creative industries, and in particular finds out what makes great music for film, for TV, for commercials, for dancing to, for cooking to, for f***ing to, and more. Today I'm having a gas with Digby Lewis, a creative director of branded content with a wealth of experience from businesses like MTV and others. Being fanatical about music, Digby was a great guest who had an extensive knowledge of musical history and theory, and so I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. So Digby, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for solving all the technical problems we just went through. I think was that your other half helping you to stretch an Ethernet cable there?
Yeah, it's the way of the world now, isn't it? You kind of rope everybody in, kind of wife, children, everyone has their part to play in solving ultimate kind of technical challenges. But we're hopefully getting there.
Yeah, hopefully. And, there's a lot of noise, isn't there, about the unpaid labour that gets done around the house. And as an interesting way of looking at the stats, really, not to say that all household labour ought to be paid. It's just to say that now we've also included media producers and runners and that kind of thing in it. So we're doing that here. Thank you for doing this. I know that we had a brief chat last week after we did our Iris Music Masterclass, after which you chimed in and just desperate to share some musical, interest with similarly minded people. So I'm sure we'll get to all that. But first of all, in a nutshell, what is it? What do you do? What does it mean to be creative director of branded content? Is a mouthful and it sounds a little bit corporate, and obviously we're really interesting arty types. So yeah, what do you do? So I've been with Iris 5 years, and over that time we've been through kind of various sort of stages of having kind of departments that focus on particular things. And when I came into the company, we didn't really have a sort of content or social media department or team as such. So the first thing really was to sort of build that as a capability, because we could see that more and more of our clients are spending more and more of their time and their money creating things that would kind of live in social. And I guess really the sort of big difference between advertising and content is that, generally advertising a brand is kind of just telling you through a loud hailer all the things it wants you to hear, right? Yes.
And on the content side of it, it's completely different. We're trying to create things, or content creators create things that audiences will want to gravitate towards, yes. Whether that's TV, film, music, or anything else. And those two things have a quite interesting kind of tension if you're working for a brand. So I think, a lot of the early work we were doing as a team, as a department, was to try and sort of navigate that kind of tension. So, what rights does a brand have to create something that somebody sitting at home or in an office or on the train is going to take time out of their day to watch, listen, perhaps even kind of to respond to. So, it's a big kind of sort of behaviour shift for advertisers, and that kind of world of kind of branded content or branded entertainment has been kind of growing steadily for quite a while now. And I think
can I ask a question in English, just to make sure I'm understanding? So advertising proper or advertising traditional is we have these broadcast media channels. We have TV, we have billboards that people can't resist looking at, and we have radio, and we can blast messaging out of it. Now, the domain, the internet has leveled the playing field a bit. You can find whatever you want, and that's what we're calling content here. It's the stuff that I go to YouTube to watch. I watch music videos, I watch production, stuff like this. And you're saying now the branded world has had to get into that domain and get involved in content that people magnetize towards without it being blasted at them.
Yeah, it's exactly that. I think historically brands have always needed that kind of intermediary, whether it's TV, billboards, out of home, in order to get that message across. And I think that when YouTube and social media came along, the ability to speak directly to people was the thing that kind of fundamentally changed. And not every brand has the opportunity to kind of build that sort of one-to-one interpersonal relationship with their customers. But you can see the kind of the big brands that have the most kind of loyal followings do have the ability to enter into that kind of dialogue with people. So that sort of fundamentally changes the types of things that you make and the types of ways that you kind of communicate with people.
Can you give us like an example? You say brands that have loyal followings can command an audience. Some brand examples. Are we thinking Nike?
I think probably we would say, Adidas is a good example. I think in the sports world, I think they have, any kind of brand, any sports brand that's able to build a kind of grassroots following. Yes. If you look at the work that Adidas does across their kind of football kind of activations, they do everything from kind of grassroots football. There's a thing called Tango League, which is more kind of sort of the world of street football, all the way up to, the kind of the big partnerships with the likes of Arsenal, obviously with the branded kits, and the work that we kind of do globally with their kind of biggest kind of global superstar players. So that's a good example of a brand kind of activating all the way through a particular kind of vertical. So you've got fans of the big club, but also you've got the kids who are out there kind of playing at the weekend.
Wow. Okay, cool. So your responsibility is to make sure that you've got brands who want to communicate directly with their audience, and it's your job to think of a clever way to do that.
Yeah, kind of. I think that some instances we think about what might be an appropriate method or format for an idea to live in social media. So, for example, when you think about the kind of the user behavior and people scrolling for miles and miles and miles every day through their phone, what is going to be either kind of visually interesting or kind of sort of catch the attention? That's kind of one thing that we think about. Another might be, and particularly in the sort of the content space, where the format of the ideas tends to be kind of longer form. So advertising traditionally is a 30-second ad spot, or maybe a 60-second if you've got a kind of a very kind of big kind of hero film to work with. But in content, we're thinking more about kind of episodic ideas, kind of more closer to kind of broadcasting type behavior. So if you have an idea that can live across half a dozen episodes that might be 3 to 5 minutes or 15 minutes or even kind of half-hour episodes, then you're sort of having to think about different ways to articulate what it is the brand is bringing to that. On one hand, is the brand simply enabling this content to get made, which is part of the brand's entertainment world. If you look at what Channel 4 is doing, there's lots of examples of brands helping TV shows get made. And then the other way is to think about, well, what is it, what is the kind of brand sort of purpose or ideals or values? And is there a way to communicate that through programming? That doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about products or offers or kind of traditional sort of merchandising, advertising type behavior. So it's a bit more kind of thematic and perhaps a bit more sort of purpose and values led. Okay,
so that's what you're doing now. And what's going to be really an interesting journey to go on is to rewind as to where you started and then figure out why it is that you're qualified to be advising these brands on this kind of thing. Because I'm sure with your level of verbal acuity, you're a very articulate person, you could probably blag your way into any job and convince people it needs doing. But you have had a journey on this, right? From there's a continuum from 7 years old to where we are now that's taken us through things like MTV and producers like that. So let's go back. How did this all start? How did the journey you're on begin?
I think there's always been an interesting thing between, because I guess the thing that's run through my whole kind of life, and as much as possible in terms of a career, is music.
Yes.
I first picked up a guitar at the age of 7. Because I had an older brother who refused to practice. So my parents said, "I'm not going to pay for your lessons anymore. Give the guitar to that one." And I don't consciously remember choosing to play the guitar. Right. I just remember going for my first lesson, and I still remember going for my first lesson, and trying to kind of understand how you kind of sort of play the different strings and kind of before you even with left-handed, kind of start moving notes around. For some reason, I just sort of took to it, and loved playing. And I think the guitar is quite difficult because, particularly at a young age, I was playing a full-size classical as well. It's quite difficult to make a good sound. And I think for kids playing instruments, I think there's that hurdle you have to get over, which is for the first kind of period of time, you're just making a noise.
Yes.
And in order to get something kind of gratifying back from it, you need to kind of get to that level of okay, this isn't just a noise now. I'm actually getting some pleasure back from it, and I can start to see how this is going to become a thing, right?
And your sense of time as a child is so augmented. Everything feels so long.
Yeah.
You imagine it probably only takes you a year to get anything like good, but that feels like 10 years if you're 7.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I started having guitar lessons. I think fairly quickly after that, I started taking piano lessons, and I sang as well. So I was kind of singing in sort of school choirs and that kind of stuff. I was put forward for a music scholarship at 12, with classical guitar being the first study. And my music teacher, my parents were ringing around various schools saying, do you have a music scholarship program? Yes, we do. What does he play? Classical guitar? Not interested. Put the phone down. Most of the schools wanted to have orchestral instrumentalists. Okay. So they wanted to have, kind of sort of violinists and cello players and woodwind players who would, in inverted commas, be useful to them when they got to school and wanted to, kind of participate in stuff, and so kind of give something back. And my school music teacher, or the school I went to, they said, "What does he play? Classical guitar." Yeah, we've never had one of them. Can you send him along? So I went along to what would have been sort of a Victorian version of an X Factor type kind of sort of panel kind of experience, where you go into a room with lots of kind of very sort of dusty people. And I sort of played guitar for a bit and played some piano and kind of sang. And they went, "Oh, that's all very good. Let's do some ear tests." And then one of them down the end sort of went, "Well, this is all very well, you're playing the guitar, but have you ever thought about playing something sort of orchestral?" And completely unprepared, and I had no idea why I said this. I said, "I've always played a trombone." And the guy on the end nearly fell off his chair. He said, "That's fantastic. We've got none of them. Can you start tomorrow?" So I went back to school, and my teacher said, "How did the exam go? Or how did the audition go?" And I said, "Well, okay, I think. Apparently I've got to start playing the trombone." He sort of rooted around in a cupboard and sort of pulled some lengths of piping out that sort of went a little bit like this. And I started playing that as well. So all the way through school, I was sort of doing lots of different things. But the trombone enabled me to get into brass bands, orchestras, that sort of more kind of communal kind of side of playing as well, which I think is really important from an instrumentalist point of view. The difference between a solo player and playing as part of an ensemble, whether it's a band, a group, or an orchestra, or even a choir, I think is really important for developing your ear and your sense of empathy and sympathy with those around you. Yeah,
that's actually a really important part of becoming part of the a school ensemble and learning the reciprocal game early on in life. Because there's a great bit by Eddie Izzard. I might try and get our editor to wedge it in, where he talks about, the typical school band experience, where, you've got the first clarinets, they get the tune. The second ones kind of get this, backup. And the third clarinets get the notes that are left over. So you're just there playing a single monotonic, going, and, everyone, there's no sense of, what would you call it, harmonic hierarchy. So the melody has to sing. Sometimes it can sink below a particularly important harmonic note, but generally you have a singing top line and then things that are supporting it underneath and making this lovely chordal sound. In school you go, "I'm going to play really loud." So obviously that was my school experience. Your school experience, I imagine, was somewhat different, because it sounds like you're describing a kind of more prestige environment in terms of how rigorous the audition process was.
Yeah, it was. It was taken quite seriously. I mean, having won a music scholarship, they're kind of paying for all of your music education. Which was great, because it enabled me to do lots of stuff and to try and immerse myself as fully as possible into it all. We then gave back a lot of our time for it as well. So in the school kind of chapel choir, we were doing, rehearsals all the time. Obviously, there were services throughout the week and at the weekends. And then there were concert tours as well. So we would kind of decamp and kind of go off and kind of do sort of big kind of international concert tours. And they're quite, intensive as a traveling orchestra would be. You know, you're kind of going from place to place to place with a sort of repertoire of things you can do. And I think that some of the sort of greatest experiences growing up was having that opportunity to travel around different places and perform, you know, to audiences all over the place, whether it be, I mean, one of the most sort of fun actually tours we did was Northern Cathedrals in England, because in terms of an environment to sing in, you know, going to York Minster or Durham or Ripon or Lincoln, or those amazing kind of architectural spaces where the music was written to be formed in exactly that kind of space.
Yes, now that's how you can tell you've read David Byrne's book, even if you came to that conclusion on your own. David Byrne makes a great case, doesn't he, for the music we listen to is actually shaped by the acoustics of our time. So cathedrals create these enormous reverbs.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's, you know, the same thing with concert halls and even now when it comes down to playing in, you know, kind of smaller rooms and you think about how digital technology is trying to mimic or emulate those kind of spaces as well. So now the ability to sit down at my laptop and think about, okay, what kind of room do I think I want this to be performed in? And if it's a sort of a quiet kind of voice and jazz guitar kind of duet number, then being able to sort of emulate that kind of small sort of jazz types of the room and space and gives you that sense of kind of ambience and feeling that kind of goes into the writing and recording process as well. So it's interesting how that is, you know, not just the audience, but actually the space you're playing or performing in is kind of really important to the music itself.
Yeah, and with regards specifically to cathedrals as well, I do sympathise with some modern thinkers who say, you know, it might not be for the best that it might not only be for the good that we've become largely a secular, or you might even say atheistic society, because with the, you know, the idea of what we've rendered into being with a cathedral, you could only do that if you were a society that believed you had to offer something up pretty substantial to something like a god. And, you know, cathedrals are remarkable things. We don't have architecture like that now, you know.
Yeah.
So, but I don't know what to think about that.
I think the interesting thing about music that was written for those particular kind of spaces is you think about church music and singing, and generally you think that it's the most conformist kind of music.
Yes.
But actually, you know, when you think about composers like Taverner, who were deeply devout and religious people.
That's for the benefit of
the really kind of sort of push the boundaries of what the human voice and the architecture can do in sympathy to each other. So there are long passages of things that just sort of blend into each other, and it just simply wouldn't work in that environment. And also, we were talking about it the other day, but composers like William Byrd, who could see that there was an opportunity within those spaces and using the voice to do something than simply singing one note per syllable or one note per word. And when he wrote his 4-part mass, at the time it was illegal to write kind of multi-syllable phrases, you know, or to stretch kind of musical phrases across, you know, a single syllable. And so you know, the ability to see the environment and to look at the rule book and go, well, actually, we're not going to follow the rules because we can push it further.
Yes.
Existed even in those times when you kind of think we think everything was kind of pretty boring.
That's really, so this hangs on to something I've been thinking about recently. Have you ever heard of a YouTuber called Vsauce?
Yes, Michael, I know him, yeah.
You know Michael?
Yeah.
Get out of here. I want to do a sketch, a Vsauce sketch, if Vsauce was president. Maybe you can put that forward to him. But he, in this video, Juvenoya, brought this quote from Orwell. What was it? Every generation imagines themselves to be more intelligent than everyone who came before them and wiser than everyone who comes after them. And so what we imagine is that the idea of non-conformity, rebellion, anarchy, we only really discovered ideas like that in about 1976 when we had punk rock. But we've always been the same humans, just living in this timeline of roughly 2,000 years is what we can kind of grip onto in our heads.
Yeah.
And even when everything was theological, everything was done from under the barrier of the church, you had punks in the church trying to break the rules.
Yeah, absolutely. And as part of my music degree, which I went on to do, I studied 20th century avant-garde classical music for a period of time. And for lots of people, that's the hardest music to listen to, It sounds dissonant, it sounds atonal. It's very difficult to kind of latch onto any sort of frame of reference, and therefore people kind of say, "Oh, I don't like modern classical music; it just sounds like an absolute dirge." And what my lecturer was getting us to understand is that's precisely because we don't understand it, we're unfamiliar with it. And actually, you kind of take any genre of music, if it's completely alien to you, and you've never heard it before, the brain doesn't know quite how to sort of synthesize it. And we're constantly looking for references and motifs that we can sort of hang on to, which is why when you think about how kind of contemporary pop music works, it's kind of built on these repeatable structures and formats that the brain recognizes. Yes. And Ray simply kind of goes, "Oh, I like this because I've heard something like it before." Yeah. And so when you think about, Shostakovich and Prokofiev and what those composers were doing, again, they were presenting people with stuff that you had never really heard before. Mm-hmm. So it's quite difficult to sort of latch onto. So again, another example of how, kind of classical music being kind of considered the traditional thing, sometimes presents us with the most challenging stuff. And I think the same thing would apply to, when you think about the kind of influence of kind of sort of modern jazz, and where, Keith Jarrett and Chick Corea and Miles Davis were sort of going in terms of pushing that tonality, and it's all kind of challenging the ear, challenging the stuff that we recognize.
Yeah, that's... You were talking about jazz, we're talking about Keith Jarrett, Chick Corea and people like that. And I like the image of the culture is kind of within this circle. It's explored territory, right? Right in the middle of that circle is the most boring stuff because it's so familiar that it's kind of slap in the middle of the mainstream. And on the edge, over the edge of the boundary is what you were describing about this 20th century atonal music. Impossible to understand because it's so unfamiliar. And on the boundary of the edge of that circle between the unknown and the known is where people like Keith Jarrett, etc., they stand as radars to try and pull in what we don't understand. So when you get modern people, for example, they think, "Oh, jazz, that's just elevator kind of, And modern jazz or jazz of, the kind of thing that you would hear at Band on the Wall now is not that at all. And obviously, Keith Jarrett and some of his stuff, a lot of it would sound to the untrained ear, and this is what you were describing about it, our brain doesn't recognize it, as kind of like... And so people would just turn it off straight away. But what's really going on there, in your opinion?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's... it takes a bit of analysis, and I think the reason that jazz is difficult to always appreciate, I think particularly, jazz is often seen as like the musician's music. Yes. And I think that if you are able to sort of analyze it, then you have to realize actually in amongst that kind of deluge of notes, there is still a structure, and the thing Miles Davis used to say, there's no such thing as a wrong note until you play the next one. And so it's all about kind of where you are in relation to your anchor. Yeah. And I think, Jacob Collier talked about this really nicely. Basically, all music really is storytelling. Mm-hmm. And it's the ability to kind of understand, you start off at a place and you're going to another place, and it's the journey that you go on, and then ultimately it's how you kind of find home again. And I think the same is true with jazz. And if you can go back to Charlie Parker and those sort of players, and it's all about understanding kind of where the chords are taking you in terms of that story, and their ability to sort of go further and further away from the path. Yeah. But still kind of come back to home again. And so I think, if you kind of went off on a completely sort of random sort of train of notes and sort of landed over there somewhere, then it would never be, it would never work. It would never resolve, And I think that even the kind of the most avant-garde jazz, when you actually kind of sit down and analyze it, I mean, there are only so many notes, right? Let's take Western tonality as the kind of the range that we're in. So
for these, just for the benefit of the audience, people who aren't familiar, by Western tonality, do we basically mean the diatonic scale?
Yeah. Anything you can play on a piano.
Yes.
And again, that's where I think the likes of Chick Corea and Keith Jarrett are interesting, because they were using voltage to push those notes from the diatonic scale out a bit. So you'd suddenly start moving things, and Herbie Hancock started using his keytar and kind of bending notes and modulation and so on. But this idea that we have a framework, we have a set of rules, and all that jazz musicians were doing and all that classical composers were doing at that time was to try and push it as far as possible, but still working within that framework to ultimately make some kind of sense.
Right. Okay. So I want to take a bit of a not a U-turn, and I can't be bothered thinking of the analogy to pull it back to where you've been and where you're going. So just on the guitar, I can see one. There's one present in case we need a Blue Peter. Here's one I made earlier. For the benefit of the YouTube viewers, can you show us the difference between classical form and what most people play it like?
So classical guitar. This is an English concert classical.
Mm-hmm.
Made by a gentleman called Robert Welford, who lives in Cambridge. This was made in 1989.
Wow.
And doesn't leave the house very much these days. I actually performed it out at a jazz night in London called Old Fashioned about a couple of years ago. That's the last time I sort of played it out. But yeah, the traditional sort of classical guitar, you often see the guitar kind of held like this. Sometimes the player has their kind of knee raised, and the sort of the technique, the action on these guitars is quite hard. You have to kind of have a good technique in order to make a sort of decent sound.
To the untrained people, action on guitar means distance between string and fretboard.
Absolutely, yeah. So the action on these, particularly on concert classicals, because the concert classical is designed to project to a hall, yeah.
Yes.
So the guitar is kind of it's nylon strings on the top three, and then it's wound strings on the kind of the bass bottom three strings. So the sound is entirely made from the instrument. So you play a note, you pluck a string, and basically kind of the sound disappears down here. It vibrates around the table, which is the front piece of the guitar, resonates, and then the sound kind of pops back out again. Yeah. And actually there's some really interesting new modern designs for flamenco and concert classicals that are experimenting with putting the holes in different parts of the instrument.
Wow.
To see how that affects both the tone but also the way that it sort of sounds. So it's a very it's got a lot of attack, the concert classical. So it's a note that has a big sort of front end and then kind of decays really sort of quickly.
Yes.
And it has a very big dynamic range as well. So you think about Rodrigo's concerto for classical guitar. They have sort of movements that are very kind of light.
Can you play us a few bars, maybe?
Sorry?
Can you play us a few bars, maybe?
I can't remember all of it now, but I think you're trying, in some instances, you're trying to kind of play a melody line over an orchestra.
Okay.
And trying to kind of deal with that, with an instrument that is effectively entirely acoustic. Mm-hmm. Is sort of quite challenging. So it's kind of just dealing with that sort of dynamic range on the classical guitar is. It's something that's kind of interesting both in terms of performance, but also thinking again about your kind of surroundings and where you're sort of playing. So that's the kind of concert classical.
And what's the way modern people play it by comparison, and what's the difference, and why is it important?
So then you have the sort of the electrified instrument. So an electric guitar like this one. So this has pickups here, which effectively are microphones. The microphones will then pick up the resonating string and then transmit that through either a cable or through a wireless into an amplifier. So if I take the adapter out, the transmitter out, there's no sound. Yeah.
Perspective, very, very dull.
It's very dull because you have a solid body instrument. That guitar has a hollow body. The sound is generated by reverberating around it and flying out the front. On this one, this is a solid body guitar, and the sound is generated through the pickups. So the sound actually is a lot more sort of controllable by the player. The classical guitar kind of has one sound. It has the dynamic range, but it sounds like a nylon string classical. With this, you kind of have the ability to play through an amplifier that has lots of different effects and processors. So most guitarists spend a lot of their time thinking about how to shape the sound, process it, because the actual kind of pure clean sound is only kind of one very specific kind of facet of what's on offer.
And that's actually also, that brings us to one of the dangers of rapid technological development, because it brings a lot of benefits and it brings a lot of opportunities. But James Blake, who is probably one of the most influential producers in the world right now, shaped the sound of the last 10 years or helped to, said, think chords, not plugins, which is his way of saying you still need to think musically more than you think about the technology. And it's very easy to get obsessed with getting that perfect guitar amp and getting just the right EQ on it, or getting just the right compression and EQ, and all of a sudden you're not thinking with a musical brain.
Yeah, absolutely. I think ultimately, we said before that the music is all about storytelling, and even if you're looking at how sort of kind of the sort of contemporary kind of pop music is written, the songs that are most interesting are the ones that still have got that kind of chordal progression, or they're doing something interesting with kind of melody and harmony. And you kind of think back to some of the sort of the greatest kind of popular works. And there's always something in that is interesting from a musical point of view. And of course, it doesn't have to always be kind of notes. You can create sounds, and you can create things that have the impression of melody and harmony that are more percussive. And you think about how perhaps kind of different cultures and different music around the world will kind of bring more of that sort of percussive element into it. I'm particularly sort of thinking kind of Eastern tonality as well, where the use of kind of bells and drums and percussionists. I mean, someone like Trilok Gertu, for example, effectively he's a percussionist, but it sounds like he's playing an orchestra because everything kind of has its own kind of sound and kind of pitch to it as well. But I think that you can totally get obsessed with the production side, whether it's the production of your sound or the production of a single piece of music, and lose sight of what was originally recorded. I heard a really interesting interview which was talking about Christina Aguilera recording the song Beautiful, that was a massive hit, probably about 15 years ago now. And she came in to record a demo. And she sat down at the piano and she played it and she sang. And the producer wanted to put that version out. And for about 9 months, Christina kept on saying, no, I want to come back and do the vocals properly. And the producer said, Linda Perry was the producer. And she said, no, I'm going to keep probably 95% of your original vocal, because that has your original intention. It wasn't overperformed, and it had that kind of raw purity that is what the song is all about. And the minute you start to overdub and overlay things and re-record, it kind of loses that sense of honesty, kind of authenticity. And you can start to feel that, it might sound more polished, but it loses that kind of X factor, which is something that actually the Beastie Boys talk about in their book. Is that when they kind of got big, they went from kind of recording stuff in their mates' bedrooms to going into kind of big shiny studios in LA, and it just didn't have the same sort of character and feeling that their original demos did.
Yes, I think that's a risk that a lot of emerging artists are quite sensitive to. I sent you some of the work by my close friend Hamdi, and he and I are locked in debate almost constantly about whether you need to basically polish the sound or not. So he's saying, I'm using cheap, nasty sounding samples because that's the current culture amongst people who are making the new emergent music and can't afford big sample packs, big studios. And then, the line side I come down on is, that's true, we need to have the authenticity. However, a bad mix still ruins a song for everyone. Like, no one can listen to a bad mix. It sounds unprofessional. And I don't know how to resolve that debate. And that's what's going on in the Aguilera example there. It's like, I'd be on the side of Christina, unfortunately. And I'm glad that we were wrong in this case. Say, no, you can't release a demo. You need to do it properly. You need to have 2 mics on the voice. You need to, so I think the debate is never resolved. That's the problem, isn't it? There's never one answer.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, I guess if you're striving to create a good sound, then capturing it in the best way possible, it makes sense. If you're seeking to manipulate a sound out of the things you've got, and actually you're not striving for some kind of 360 sort of experience, then that is part of the character and the reason you're kind of doing it that way. And I think that it's always easier or better to record something well and then produce it into a corner than to start off in a corner and then realise that you can't really kind of take it anywhere because you just don't have the sonic spectrum to work with.
Right. So is that a way of saying you can easily you can't start? It's harder to start with something bad and make it good than to start with something brilliant. You can easily just don't touch it too much, leave it as it is, but you can easily knock that into nothing by overproducing it.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think you can, and that's the same reason why. I mean, I tend to record a lot of my guitar stuff completely clean because then I know I've got the flexibility in post-production to try different things out, whether it's different reverbs or effects or processing the signal in some way, or perhaps to kind of double track it, or even just kind of leave it as it was. Whereas if I put all that stuff on the pedal board in front of the guitar, in front of the recorder, then you don't really kind of have anywhere to sort of go to.
Yeah. Okay. So what we have established here is that it was music that started off your journey in life, and you're obviously very knowledgeable and very well equipped and very experienced. So the question is, why, when leaving school, did you not descend into a life of, only being musical? How did you end up being branded content director at Iris? Yeah,
I think my degree, I was able to do a degree that was a combined media studies and music degree. And for the first time, that the emphasis was away from practical playing, although there were a couple of kind of studio production modules that I did. And it was much more kind of sort of theory and sort of classroom led. And at the time I was thinking, because when I left school, one of the potential routes was to try and get into one of the conservatoires and be a classical guitarist.
Yeah.
But the kind of career prospects for classical guitarists are fairly limited. It's not kind of in the vanguard at the moment, the classical guitar.
And most people out there can't name a single classical guitarist.
Yeah, and I think that over the years there are probably sort of kind of a handful that have been successful. I mean, there are some around today. Milos is probably the most kind of widely known as a young guy who kind of plays the guitar brilliantly and commands sort of concert orchestras. But when I was growing up as a kid, we used to think of. I remember going to see Andre Segovia when I was very small. And he was like the kind of the god of guitar. Julian Bream, John Williams for a long while was the other two great players. John Williams kind of went more into the sort of the popular world, whereas Julian Bream stayed very kind of pure to the classical guitar and the lute that he played. But I also used to love the likes of John McLaughlin, who also used to collaborate with guitarists in different genres as well. So Paco de Lucia I discovered as a result of John McLaughlin. So John McLaughlin played lots of kind of very sort of far out kind of jazz fusion with Miles Davis in the 60s and 70s. But he also did lots of very flamenco influenced work with Al Di Meola and Paco de Lucia. So in terms of what I was thinking of doing was probably kind of looking for a career. And I knew that the pressure to get into music college as a player was kind of very high. And also I didn't realize at the time that there were kind of other viable alternatives to being a solo instrumentalist.
Yeah.
I didn't really know, for example, that you could have a career as a session player. And obviously kind of many people have gone on to be prolific and very successful kind of session players for different artists, and that takes a lot of the pressure away from you being the artist as well. So I didn't realise that existed. But one of my teachers,
a good example for sort of the mainstream audiences of a successful session player would be, everyone knows "Life on Mars" by David Bowie.
Yeah.
The session piano was, of course, Rick Wakeman.
Yeah.
And Rick Wakeman appeared on so many. I believe this is correct. He appeared on so many popular records while he was at, I think he was at Royal College, that they kicked him out. You just keep doing sessions and not doing your work, so just go and make money doing sessions. And well, what are we doing? So.
So in my school holidays, I used to work at a local Italian restaurant called Villaggio's. And the Villaggio's was run and is still run by the Palladino family. Marco, who was one of the sons, who was managing the restaurant, would talk about his brother, who was often away playing on session work or doing kind of live. And every now and again, this kind of really sort of tall guy would sort of come into the restaurant, and he was gigantic and looked really impressive and looked kind of very different to everyone else. And I would say, who's that? And he'd say, well, that's Pino Palladino. And Pino Palladino is probably the greatest bass session player in history. Wow. He's played on everything from kind of Live Aid. He did all the Elton John stuff. For a period of time, Trevor Horn and the big producers would only book him. Wow. So that was an interesting insight into a kind of a world that sort of did exist, but trying to understand how to get into that, I kind of had sort of no idea. But there are some wonderful kind of session players. I mean, even think about kind of the Rolling Stones, and actually kind of some of the biggest bands in the world have and still do rely on session players to sort of keep them kind of going. So Ronnie Wood was a session guitarist. Yeah. He wasn't a full-time member of the band for a long while. Yeah. So and that kind of relationship always is kind of there between the sort of, in inverted commas, hired help and the ones who are they're kind of founder members, if you will. So I think that's interesting, is understanding kind of where the opportunities as a career kind of take you. Yeah.
No, that is the distinction, isn't it? There's the difference between performing musician and artist, whose ideas are respected. And in the modern environment where everything's done on laptops and digital workstations, the closest, I suppose, to the new analogy for a session musician is like a producer, isn't it? We got someone to produce the beat for this track. That often is the case with, I know Drake's exec producer is Noah Shabib, aka 40, but often they get some guest producer to produce the beat for Non-Stop or Passion Fruit. I think Passion Fruit was done by a Londoner. But it's a similar thing, isn't it? Is, you are not necessarily going to get name artist status, but your skills are so lauded that you are considered a valuable resource. And often through doing that, you become known for your style. Obviously, Wakeman's style became associated with that Life on Mars kind of flowery pseudo-classicalism. Yeah,
and I think that through all genres, there have been great session musicians who have left that kind of magic dust across the work they've done. In the guitar world, I think about Spanky Alford, who was a brilliant R&B guitarist, who's done everything, from D'Angelo's work through to kind of more sort of traditional kind of soul and R&B. And you can hear that it's there, and it adds something completely different and unique. And without that kind of element, even if it's just a kind of a small part, it just changes the entire kind of shape and ultimate result of the work as well. So you can have a really important part to play. It's like I liken it to sort of a character actor in a film.
Yes.
Somebody who sort of comes on, it might be only a small role, but they add something special that kind of gives it that kind of sense of kind of shape and kind of fulfillment.
And they never get the kind of lead status, but they're always heralded for their, appearance as, someone. Can you think of any good examples? I'm trying to think of one now.
Trying to think who's
do you know the West Wing at all?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, Richard Schiff, who plays Toby Ziegler in that, whenever he turns up, he's usually very high quality, and you're going to get a solid, theatrical trained proper performance.
Yeah.
You would never see him being, Daniel Day-Lewis or Philip Seymour Hoffman kind of status.
Yeah, quite. Steve Buscemi is another example of an actor that kind of turns up in a lot of things.
Yes.
I think a lot of the kind of Tarantino films do a brilliant job of bringing in great characters who just have small parts to play. So,
a big part of Tarantino's initial a big part of Tarantino's world is reviving the careers of actors who he just watched the movie over the weekend and loved it and had to cast them. So
yeah. And also the music as well. I mean, I think he was responsible for bringing that whole kind of desert rock sound through, because he was going back into kind of 60s Americana and uncovering music that people just hadn't heard for a long time, and it brings it back to kind of popular attention, which is, I think, the getting into the sort of the role of kind of music in TV, film, and advertising. I think it plays a really important part. Whether you're an aspiring artist, it's still a great discovery opportunity, but also, it enables, music is all just about discovery, isn't it? I mean, you can spend a lifetime thinking that you have a fairly good handle on certain genres or kind of certain aspects of it, and then you turn a page and realize that you actually just only know one tiny fragment of the universe, and there's still so much out there.
Yeah, I mean, that was the example with my dad. We were devoted enough to jazz that we saw Dave Brubeck on his final tour at the Bridgewater Hall, and yet my dad didn't hear the Cologne concert by Keith Jarrett until 2007.
Yeah.
And like, how have I missed this entire swath of jazz? So, but this is again, we've established, you had some options, and how did you get to MTV?
I was writing. I was basically working as a freelance journalist. I'd been doing bits and pieces when I left college. Basically, by the time I left university, I was playing in bands. I spent my 3 years at university basically in bands.
Yes.
And doing some session work, bits and pieces of session work. I then kind of started to kind of do some freelance writing as a kind of a day job, and did some bits and pieces for newspapers and some magazine work. I took 2 years out. I went to the Far East for a couple of years. My brother lived in Hong Kong, and I went out there for a holiday. And it was just pre the handover of '97, and decided to stay there for a while. I ended up spending 2 years there because I thought it was just an incredible place, so different to anything I'd experienced before, and going through a very really interesting time in its history as well, with the transfer of power back to China. And I got a job working on a couple of magazines, and was starting to kind of forge a career as a writer. And when I came back to the UK, having done a few more magazine jobs, an opportunity came up at MTV to work in their international team as a kind of website writer and editor. And we would do everything from kind of events coverage. We would do some kind of movie reviews, and also we would interview bands as well. And we had a very kind of close relationship with MTV News, which operated as a kind of a central production team. And we used to, artists would come over from wherever. We would do a 45-minute network interview with them, and then that tape would then get sent around the regions if the talent wasn't able to travel to that market. So it meant that we were able to capture lots in London and kind of service all of the regions with this interview content, which would go into their kind of daily news bulletins. And the UK team used to kind of get their own time as well, because it was happening often in the same location. But I spent 5 years there, effectively migrating from being a kind of a writer-editor into being a kind of TV producer-director, and doing lots of news interviews.
What year did you begin?
2001 to 2006, and I did a year freelance after that.
So you were kind of on the time that traditional media started showing its first cracks.
Yeah. I mean, the role of MTV at the time, particularly in terms of a music programming platform, was to premiere and to promote the artists through the music video. So, you think about kind of the sort of heyday of the music video really was sort of the end of the 90s, early 2000s, where, the biggest artists in the world, whether it was Michael Jackson, Madonna, they were creating these amazing kind of set piece videos that were cinematic in quality, hugely high production values.
Yes, directors who were like name directors.
Yeah, directors like Hype Williams, who would get paid millions of dollars to produce a Janet Jackson video, for example, or a Michael Jackson video. And some of the greatest film directors were getting gigs as music video directors. And I think what was interesting about the early 2000s is you then had a new generation of director that came through, who started off in music pop promos first, before going on to be successful with film. And Spike Jonze is probably the most famous example of that. So you think about the Weapon of Choice video, a lot of the Fatboy Slim stuff. He was sort of creating, kind of art form. Chris Cunningham, another great example of a director that sort of started out in kind of pop promos. Michel Gondry, again, they all had these kind of very sort of idiosyncratic kind of style to their kind of filmmaking, their storytelling, that seemed to marry brilliantly with the music and with the artists they work with. And so I think that period of time was interesting for seeing the music video as an art form in itself, not just a promotional vehicle to help sell the artist. And the music and the video kind of really went well together. But I remember very clearly the day when, rather than sitting down as a department and looking through all of the videos that had been sent to us by the labels on a Monday morning, we were getting sent links by the labels of YouTube videos that existed, and suddenly that whole dynamic changes, because you kind of go, well, wait, aren't we as the broadcaster meant to be the people that write the playlist and then kind of present this, and like a radio station, we're sort of the tastemakers really, and it suddenly went to being, well, no, we're just another part of the audience, because the content is out there for people to discover.
It's already shipped.
Yeah, it's already shipped. The labels have put it out themselves, or the artists. This is probably just before the time when individual artists started to build their own kind of fan bases through video and social media. But certainly you could see there was a big shift away from the relationship between the labels and the broadcasters, and the labels and the artists and the audience directly.
There's an analogy I was wondering if you think has any value, which is music videos were originally a promotional tool. Ergo, a music video was a TVC for an album or a single. And it became an art form. A music video was for its own sake, something that ought to look and have its own look and feel, and be its own experience that you can just enjoy for its own sake. We as an industry often get criticized for kind of becoming obsessed with making the TVC the piece of work in its own right. It's like, well, Andy Bundy, who came on this, the creative director of the AM Partnership, he said, we're not curating an art gallery. We're trying to communicate our clients' wishes. And I was wondering, it's been quite a successful tack for the music video to turn it into just an enjoyable piece of art of its own. Are we trying to do that with commercials? Have we tried to do that? Is it worth doing that? I think people ought to enjoy adverts even if they don't want what you're trying to sell them. Yeah.
I think the ability for advertising to entertain is something that we shouldn't lose sight of. There was a period of time when it might be a stretch to say that people looked forward to the ad break. Certainly there were some really kind of big set piece ads, and I'm thinking about brands like Levi's that use music in such an iconic way that when you heard Marvin Gaye's I Heard It Through the Grapevine and you saw Nick Cayman walking into the laundrette, it was a piece of cinema. It was a piece of art. And it didn't always have to be sort of worthy. You think about how we can use sort of comedy music to comedic effect as well. But I think this notion of entertaining through ads is something that kind of really helps to establish a bond and a connection between the consumer and the audience and the brand. And it doesn't always have to be, kind of necessarily kind of pushing a product front and center. Yes, that's part of the story. But I think that the kind of emotional attachment that we have with the music, it stays with you, and that's why there are probably half a dozen ads that everyone kind of reels off that always mention the same relationship between the brand and the music, because it's remained intact. And to the point where it's sort of become the music video almost, for that track, even if it was not originally intended for that. So I think that it is really interesting. And when the quality of advertising starts to dip and things start to feel a bit more functional or direct perhaps, and lose the kind of craft, then I think that's kind of when you kind of see both the effectiveness kind of drops off, but also I think that relationship between the music or the sound of the ad and the message seems to have become kind of detached somehow. Yeah. So I think a great song choice. One of my favourites in recent years is the Audi ad with "Send in the Clowns." I mean, a beautiful song, kind of re-performed in a way that felt like it was bringing something kind of new to it. So the song had the familiarity in it because you might know the kind of the Sinatra version or kind of various other kind of sort of standard versions of that amazing kind of song. But to hear it sung differently, presented differently, but used very sympathetically with the visuals, that is still something that we should not lose sight of. And I think that the challenge for us is always around the budgets, what we have to work with. And sometimes the cost of attaching music can be really substantial, particularly around the big set piece ads that you tend to get towards the end of the year. And so I think actually that's where some of the work that you guys do as well is interesting, because it's sometimes finding the less obvious pathway to create something that still has that sense of unique character to it.
Yeah. Do you think we are in a period of time? A lot of people are describing the current era as fairly disappointing for advertising, for the quality of advertising. Do you think we're in an era of, what's the word I'm looking for? Are we in a bit of self-doubt? Are we having a crisis of confidence? Yeah,
I think possibly it's caused, I think that is true. I think it's caused by lots of different reasons. The multiple options that brands have now in terms of communicating means that things like media budgets are kind of more stretched or more fractured. Mm-hmm. So whereas you might have invested, all of your budget into creating an amazing film that was going to go on TV because TV was the main method for reaching people at home, TV is now just one of several. And various studies have shown how effective TV advertising still is in getting your message across, getting in front of your audience, having them understand what it is you're trying to kind of convey. But the options for marketeers now are so varied, so they stretch across social media, and of course that's multiple channels. I think there's been a trend towards using social channels because they have been able to sell themselves very effectively around this idea of that our data shows that we can put our stuff in front of exactly the right kind of people you're looking to market to.
Yes.
And I think that we've had probably a few years now to look at that and go, well, you might have a very good data set, but we're not really sure that the advertising format is actually kind of as effective within that channel, because that's not what people are looking for.
So the meme that is gathering like a snowball at the moment is the skipping of the YouTube ad. No one ever watches a YouTube ad ever. I mean, maybe a fraction of a percentile, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. I mean, I think that and that's why YouTube have brought in things like the 6-second spot, and they started to talk about ways to break your 30-second story down into small bite-sized chunks. So you might serve a 6-second ad before the thing you want to see, because as a viewer, I'm not going to be so upset at having to wait 6 seconds for this that I'm going to switch off. Yep. I will, in that 6 seconds, get some kind of message about who the brand is or what the story is, and then I'll get retargeted somewhere down the line, whether it's another mid-roll ad within the same video if it's a long-form video, or the next time I go back on the platform, I'll get served another part of the story. So starting to chunk your story up into chapters. That's something which is, as a technique, is kind of being used a lot. But I think that lots of these techniques are there to mitigate the loss of people's willingness to engage with it. So when you kind of say, a decade or so ago, when we had these kind of great set piece ads that people did want to gather around and watch because it was a big broadcast moment, these days I think that the majority of advertising people just don't want to engage with. They want to make their own decisions. They feel they're equipped to do the research themselves and make their own decisions. And I think advertising has to work a lot harder in order to sort of convert people into the customers and to retain customers. So I think the quality measure is partly a factor of the pressures that we're under as advertisers to get in front of lots of different people at lots of different times, and also the effectiveness of the formats that we are being told are the right things to use.
I have an intuition as well, just to add on to that people find narrowcast, on the whole, a little bit creepy. The fact that you can track my interests and then advertise explicitly to me what you already know I've expressed an interest in, I actually don't want to be watched that closely. I like broadcast because you're not just looking at me.
Yeah, I think the relationship that we have with social media is interesting because I suspect that in generations to come, we will look back at our willingness to surrender privacy as something that was incredibly alarming because, we wouldn't willingly surrender our security. We wouldn't willingly surrender our finances or our health. And yet we are constantly giving data about our lives and our preferences to these giant tech platforms. And guess what? They're using them to serve ads back to us. And the reason is because they're free at the point of use, so I don't pay to subscribe to name a social media platform. And the transaction is I feed the machine with enough information for it to know what to sell to me. And I'm constantly, so even though I work in the industry, I'm still surprised when something might pop up on an Instagram feed that I'm not even consciously aware that I've been looking for. Somehow it seems to know me better than I know myself. And I think that
I just want to put something in for the viewers or the listeners if we've retained them for this long, which is I think it comes from the Vsauce episode, How People Disappear, and there's a fascinating anecdote at the beginning of that about the fact that Target, through marketing data, figured out that a young lady was pregnant before she had told her family and had started mailing her relevant coupons for pregnancy.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the relationship with data platforms is it's definitely it's in flux at the moment because I think people are starting to realise that their privacy their data has been given up and therefore they are at the behest of them. And I think that you look at a sort of a younger generation coming through that is certainly kind of more conscious of it and will seek to have a different relationship with the tech platforms that perhaps people a generation or so kind of older have done. And I think there's that trade-off between yes, I would like to cut to the chase and find the thing I'm looking for without me having to do all the heavy lifting, which is where AI and algorithms can be useful. But there's a step too far, which is I really didn't want you to tell my family something about me that I hadn't got around to telling them yet myself. Yeah. So I think the question for the next 5 to 10 years will be how much power do we continue to give these platforms without some degree of either accountability or for us to be able to take back some degree of control over what we sort of hand over.
I also, as an addendum to that, want to offer up a thought to you. Do you ever have people saying to you, or maybe it's a thought you've had yourself, oh, I'm sure my phone microphone is listening to me because I got an advert for something that I didn't explicitly search for?
Yeah, and I don't know whether it's true or not. I mean, I've looked at the settings on the apps and I've turned off, the microphone where I can, and those things you sort of do to sort of safeguard yourself. I was on a shoot a couple of years ago, and I was talking to a director about a certain kind of iPhone gimbal you could get, which effectively was like a handheld Steadicam.
Yes.
So you pop your iPhone into this kind of holder, and it means that you can kind of run around and walk around, and with phones being able to take 4K and beyond kind of quality footage now, you can record some great stuff on your phone. And we were just talking about this thing that he'd been using on a shoot recently. And in our next, I think in the lunch break the same day, I was on Instagram and scrolling through, and I got served an ad for the very thing he was talking about. And I know for a fact I hadn't had any time during the day to go on a search for it. But somehow that have been kind of served to me. Now, is it coincidence that the algorithm knows me so well that it's looking for things that might be on the market? I don't know. You can probably argue it either way, but it seemed pretty creepy to me.
Yeah, I think I often turn to my brother for help with critical thinking stuff like that because he's a Manchester grammar and an Oxford boy and now works in the government, and so he's got a more disciplined line of thinking than I do. And I asked him about that, and he said, well, consider the number of things you talk about that don't get advertised to you.
Yeah.
It's not by any means a conclusion, but it's an interesting thing to weigh up in the argument.
Yeah, of course. I mean, obviously, you notice the things that stand out. And I guess that the thing is that so many messages pass us by now, whether physically or digitally, at the moment far more digitally, obviously, because we're just simply not kind of going out, which is another thing which is changing the industry. You know, we've had a year now where outdoor media, experiential, all that side of the industry really just hasn't had a role to play at all, and everything has become digital, and so that has an impact on, you know, kind of digital content and digital advertising, you know, and our relationship with it has also kind of changed because of what's been going on. So I think that's it. You know, we are inundated with signals all the time, and so the things that kind of do take your notice either do because they're genuinely really useful, and actually, thank you very much, that's probably saved me some time, or has creeped you out, and you just think, well, hang on, I wasn't aware that the relationship was working in that way.
Yes. Let's use you mentioned lockdown, and thankfully, I think this may be one of the only podcasts that I've recorded wherein we didn't spend half an hour talking about how was last year, what did you do, what was March like, scary, right? And so the implications of lockdown that are relevant to you are very interesting, and let's talk about the music festival that you were describing to me when we initially spoke, and also the relationship that the lockdown had with the ability of artists to, you know, expand their presence in the marketplace.
Yeah, so I think for all the creative industries and for performers, obviously, whether you're a musician or a comedian,
someone whose food is put on the table by going out where people can gather.
Exactly. Yeah, all of that has been decimated, and will really struggle to return to where it was before. And you know, through my work, but also through my sort of my hobbies, and I class kind of sort of playing and performing music now as a hobby. You know, all of that has been kind of sort of taken away, and I speak to friends of mine who are active musicians, professionals, kind of touring and recording, and you know, they haven't been able to do very much at all over the last year, apart from write at home. That's the only thing that people have done. So last year, when one of our clients is Barclay Hard, and they sponsor a number of kind of music festival activations across the year. So they used to have British Summertime, which was a Hyde Park festival, but they also have a number of other festivals, Reading and Leeds being an example of one, Isle of Wight, Latitude, and so on. So they kind of help to support music festivals in that sense. With all those festivals absent last year, the challenge we had is what do we do that can have some kind of positive impact on an industry that's really struggling? And the thing that we were talking about is, if you're a headline artist and you already have 5 million people following you on Instagram, and you have a pretty good YouTube channel, and you have a platform, and you have a means to sustain interest, and maybe you use the time just to go back in the studio and write the next project, you're going to be less heavily impacted as an artist that's just looking to break through at the moment. So someone that was looking at the 2020 festival season as an opportunity to get out there in front of a big audience for the first time. Those are the guys that really stood to lose the most from that complete absence of any kind of live music, because they were at that critical stage in their kind of careers where labels don't support new talent for that long. They kind of have basically, one chance to kind of to land something.
Let me just jump in there with, HMD, perfect example. Dean released 2019 on Black Butter, a Sony subsidiary, 500,000 streams. He put out a single a couple of weeks ago that's done less than 200. Yeah.
And also, artists are taking it upon themselves to build their fan bases independently of a relationship with a record label as well. And so Arctic Monkeys were probably one of the first bands to really kind of generate a social following.
MySpace at the time.
Yeah, before they sort of became kind of commercially sort of successful, and they had the power of that. But for those acts that were suddenly without any opportunity to play live, we came up with a mechanic whereby the famous acts could use their talent and their fame to shine a light on those that needed it the most. So we created a format called Share the Stage, which ran as 4 episodes on YouTube, and then Channel 4 did a 1-hour special with Fern Cotton as our host. But we filmed it at Abbey Road Studios. And the mechanic basically was, kind of headline artist as a cover version of an up-and-coming band who they rate, and it gets their big audience to see this band probably for the first time. And it's also an interesting kind of dynamic. You look at the cover version is quite an interesting way to either introduce your fans to something new that talks about a different facet of your identity as an artist or an act, gives you permission to sort of get out of your lane a little bit as well, have some fun and be a bit playful. And so we were kind of using this sort of technique as, really as a benevolent move, which was to try and help kind of shine a spotlight on those that kind of needed it the most. But I also think it's just really interesting as a music fan to hear someone and hear their take on somebody else's song, whether you're established or not, And I think that we were talking about some of the other, the interesting cover versions of songs that have been used in ads before. And I think it kind of works both ways. You can be an up-and-coming artist and you can use a well-known song to catapult yourself into the spotlight, but also you can kind of go the other way. So the whole campaign was built around trying to shine a light on kind of the up-and-coming talent that needed the biggest leg up the most because of last year. And I guess what we're looking at this year is how we kind of extend that into a world where festivals do start to happen at some point. So what is sort of the relationship between the headliners and the people that not only have you not seen play live for a year, but you may be seeing for the first time, and also there's a whole load of stuff that's been written over the last 12 months that hasn't had an audience yet. So I think the next, the tail end of this summer next year will be really interesting for music, because I think there's going to be a whole load of stuff coming through, because writing is the only thing that people have really been able to do.
Yes, and writing it without a scene that or a culture that's shifting as quickly, and so maybe there'll be some different influences and some different sounds coming through. So that's something you've been doing with Iris more recently, and I suppose in a sense that takes us from where we started to where we are now, and it's also now about 11:40, which means you've given us more than an hour of your time. Is there anything else you want to get in before we wrap up?
Wow, I mean, God, we've been all over the place, haven't we?
Yeah.
I just think that it's really interesting for creatives to really continue to pursue this idea of the meaning that the music has in their work, and whether that's in advertising use, or whether it's in kind of more my world, which is probably the more kind of branded content space or brand entertainment. I think that the opportunity to kind of borrow interest is kind of really fascinating. And I think that the sort of marriage of pictures and sound is something that will continue to be kind of sort of really, really important. And as we sort of go through, this evolution of social media and where we are at the moment, and I think what's been one of the biggest frustrations for creatives is having to work with platforms that talk about being sound off. I think that's kind of probably one of the most kind of disappointing things to see in a brief, which is like,
we don't need to broadcast to that sense anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of sort of design for that world. Well, let's hopefully not have to design for that world anymore, and design for a world where sound is kind of very much on, because I think without that, I think you lose so much of the story and so much of the meaning. So that's the thing really for us is to kind of keep looking at those opportunities, whether it's through commercial music that's been released, whether it's through identifying new stuff that is yet to find an audience, or even through sort of composition. And we haven't really kind of touched on composition today much, but when you think about the role that composed music has, both in terms of film and TV, you can probably get into a whole other podcast about, the work of John Williams, for example, or Joe Hoyoshishi, the guy who writes the music for the Studio Ghibli films. I think I've got his name wrong, but the whole kind of area of original music written for TV, film, for ads, and for content is all kind of also super important. So I just I think that it's however we can retain that interest in it, whether it's through kind of sort of sharing ideas collectively. Obviously, at the moment it's difficult for us to kind of share ideas in the same room as each other. So,
yes.
Forums like this, I think are kind of really valuable. So, again, thanks for having me on the show today, and have the opportunity to kind of sort of chat at length with you about some of the stuff that kind of I've been through as well. But I just think it's kind of fundamentally important to our work, and we mustn't lose sight of it.